There's a version of this war you've probably never heard. Not the one on the front pages, not the one with flags and slogans and clear-cut heroes. I'm talking about the version that lives inside ordinary people, the ones who left before the cameras arrived, who carried their whole world in a single bag and never quite found the right words to explain why. I met some of those people at a summer bonfire in Estonia, and what they told me changed the way I look at everything happening in Ukraine right now. Let me set the scene. Estonia is a small country, just over 1.5 million people, sitting at the northeastern edge of Europe with a long, complicated memory of what Russian power actually feels like up close. Since the full-scale invasion began in early 2022, more than 30,000 Ukrainians found shelter here. For a nation our size, that's an enormous number. Estonians, broadly speaking, have embraced these newcomers with open arms, and when it comes to military support relative to our own stockpiles, Estonia consistently ranks among the top contributors to Ukraine's defense. The solidarity here is genuine, and it runs deep. But the story I want to tell you happened not in a government office or a refugee center. It happened on a warm June evening in the middle of the forest, around a fire, during one of our oldest and most beloved celebrations, Midsummer, the night that follows the longest day of the year. Every June, Estonians leave their cities behind and scatter into the countryside, toward the lakes and the sea and the pine forests that cover half this land. There's grilling, there's laughter, there's the kind of slow, honest conversation that only happens when the sun refuses to set and the world feels, for a few hours, manageable. That particular midsummer brought me together with 5 Ukrainians, all originally from Kherson, the southern city that Russian forces seized in the early days of the war. We were connected through overlapping circles of school friends and their parents, some of whom worked at the same factory as 2 of the Ukrainians. 3 of them were a family, a father named Alexander, his wife Emma, and their daughter, Nastya, who was around 20 years old while her parents were in their 50s. The other 2 were Nastya's boyfriend, Anatoly, 22, and his younger sister, Irina, just 17. Only one of the 5 was technically a war refugee in the formal sense. Alexander had actually come to Estonia back in 2014, shortly after the political upheaval that toppled the Yanukovych government in Kiev. The others had followed at different points, some in September of 2021, months before the invasion began. Still, they all carried Kherson with them. They had all left a city that was now under occupation, and they all had thoughts they were willing to share if I asked carefully enough. I want to be honest about something. Before that evening, I had grown accustomed to a certain kind of conversation with Ukrainians I met in Estonia, one where the positions were clear and the unity was total. And I don't say that critically. The invasion was brutal and unprovoked, and the resolve of the Ukrainian people has genuinely been extraordinary. But what Alexander said to me that night didn't fit neatly inside that frame, and I think it's important to sit with that discomfort instead of looking away from it. Alexander is a working man in every sense of the phrase. He paints ships at the Tallinn shipyard, industrial coating work, long hours, unglamorous, reliable. He likes a cold drink and a straight conversation. He's not a political man, not someone who follows the news the way analysts do, but he has lived through enough to have earned his opinions the hard way. When I asked him about the war, his answer was measured and a little jarring. He told me he doesn't particularly trust the current Ukrainian government. He called them thieves, and then, almost in the same breath, said Yanukovych was a thief too, as if the comparison was meant to collapse any illusion that the Maidan revolution had fundamentally changed things for people like him. In his view, ordinary citizens in Kherson didn't gain much from what happened in 2014. Jobs were still scarce, The ones that existed didn't pay enough to live on. He left not because of politics, but because of economics, because he needed to provide for his family, and Kherson had nothing left to offer him. This is a detail that tends to get lost in the way we discuss Ukraine in the West. We talk about the revolution in terms of values, of democratic aspirations, of a people choosing Europe over authoritarian backsliding. All of that is real. But for a man in an industrial city in the south, what that moment meant in practical terms was different. Alexander said that what works for Western Ukrainians doesn't automatically work for people in the East, and when I pressed him on whether the two halves of the country feel genuinely distinct to him, he said yes, without hesitation. He mentioned that when he worked briefly in Western Ukraine, locals had mocked him for speaking Russian. They wanted everyone to speak Ukrainian. He didn't say this with rage. He said it the way someone mentions a door that was quietly closed in their face. It stayed with him. He felt like a stranger in his own country, and that feeling matters, not because it justifies anything, but because ignoring it means missing something true about how national unity is actually built, or lost. When I asked Alexander about how the people of Kherson responded to the Russian takeover, his answer was unsettling in its bluntness. He said the population was roughly split, with maybe a quarter simply indifferent to whoever was in charge. He told me about a cousin back in Kherson, someone who, the moment Russian soldiers arrived, was ready to wave a Russian flag in the street. Alexander described him without softening the portrait. The kind of man, he said, who will align himself with whoever gives him the opportunity to take what isn't his. It wasn't an endorsement, it was a diagnosis. And yet, and this is what I kept returning to afterward, Alexander does not support Russia. He doesn't support the invasion. He was clear about that. He said this conflict could have been handled through diplomacy, that the deaths of thousands of people were not inevitable, that war was the worst possible answer to whatever the underlying tensions were. He wasn't rooting for Moscow, but he also wasn't waving a blue and yellow flag. He was sitting somewhere in the middle, exhausted, skeptical of both capitals, worried about the people he knows back home. What frightened him most, he said, was not the occupation itself, but the prospect of a Ukrainian military campaign to reclaim the city. If Kherson was handed over to Russian control without a full-scale battle, he said, then so be it, because the alternative, a liberation through urban warfare, would mean rubble and bodies. He didn't want Kherson freed at that price. He wanted the people inside it to survive. I have thought about that a lot since that evening. In the Western conversation around this war, there's almost no space for that position. We've built a moral architecture where liberation is always the right answer, and compromise is always suspect. But Alexander was asking a simpler and harder question. What about the people who are already living there right now, while the strategy is being debated in foreign capitals? He also said something that stuck with me about age and perspective. He observed that support for Russia tended to be generational, that younger Ukrainians, those who had no personal memory of the Soviet Union, had no patience for Russian claims of cultural or historical authority over Ukraine. His own daughter Nastya, he said, was nothing like him in this regard. She opposed the invasion passionately, without ambiguity. The older you were, the more likely you were to carry some residual sympathy, or at least familiarity with Russian cultural weight. Not agreement, just familiarity. That distinction matters. I didn't get to speak much with Nastya directly, which I regretted, but her boyfriend Anatoly shared a few observations that added another layer to the picture. He's 22, also working in manufacturing, and he told me about something that surprised him when he first arrived in Estonia, finding Russian-speaking Estonians at his workplace who supported Russia. He'd assumed that everyone in Estonia would be firmly against the war, and discovering that this wasn't universally true disoriented him. He'd expected solidarity and encountered, in some corners, something more complicated. Anatoly was careful to distance himself from any pro-Russian sentiment, and I believed him. But I also sensed, without him ever saying it directly, that he understood the weight of what Alexander had described, the sense that life in Kherson was genuinely hard, that Kyiv felt distant and indifferent, that the reality of people in smaller eastern cities didn't always map onto the national narrative being projected from the capital. He said as much. What you see in Kyiv isn't what Ukraine looks like everywhere. At one point, I found myself in the strange position of trying to explain to a young Ukrainian man why Ukraine was a better option for him than Russia. I stopped myself mid-sentence. It was absurd. He knew his own life far better than I did. What he was really pushing back against, gently, without confrontation, was the assumption that the choice was obvious, that the path was clear, that everything would resolve itself if the right side simply won. Emma, Alexander's wife, was quieter than the others for most of the evening. She came alive when I told her about a translation project I work on.
One that documents the war through primary sources. From her reaction, I understood that she was more aligned with Ukraine's cause than her husband, more emotional about it, more invested. She seemed like someone who had made peace with where she was, who found small comforts in daily life in Estonia, but who carried an open wound of longing for home. She wanted to go back someday. She said it simply, without drama. Then there was Irina. She was the last of the 5 to leave Kherson. At 17 years old, she watched Russian armored vehicles roll into her city. She saw the occupation begin from the street level, as a teenager, without the buffer of distance or age. On the drive out to our Midsummer celebration that evening, we passed an open-air military museum that a local Estonian had assembled from equipment found across the country. The museum was closed, but there were old Soviet-era vehicles parked outside, and we stopped to look. Alexander and Anatoly told me later that Irina couldn't stand to be near them. She was the last one to approach, the last one to leave, and her discomfort was visible to everyone. The sight of military machinery, even rusted, even decades old, even in the middle of a summer meadow, brought back the images of those first days in Kherson. She was 17. She had seen a city fall. Those are not memories that dissolve in good weather. I didn't push her. I didn't push any of them more than was appropriate. The evening was a celebration, and there are things that deserve to be protected. But I keep coming back to this. Alexander told me he didn't want his city caught in the crossfire again. And in the West, we've become so accustomed to framing this war in terms of territorial integrity and military objectives that we've quietly stopped asking what the people actually living inside those territories want from their tomorrows. For Alexander, the question of which flag flew over Kherson was secondary to whether his family and neighbors would still be alive when it was over. There are millions of people like him inside Ukraine, not collaborators, not traitors, not apologists for any government, just people who've been let down by multiple systems, who speak the wrong language in the wrong region, who watched jobs disappear and promises evaporate and couldn't afford to be idealistic about any of it. The challenge for Ukraine's leadership, and it is a genuine challenge, not a criticism, is to reach those people, to make them feel included in whatever future is being built, rather than leaving them to conclude that neither side has ever truly seen them. Because if that inclusion never comes, the gaps don't close, they widen. And in those widened gaps, old resentments find new oxygen. The strongest argument against Russian influence in places like Kherson isn't military. It's the lived experience of people who feel genuinely valued by their own country. Alexander never quite had that experience. He's not sure his children will either. That's the wound underneath the war that nobody's news segment is covering, and it's the one that will matter most when the fighting is finally over.